Hi everybody, Terrible Dactyl here, and welcome to a new mini-series that I'm trying out, sort of uncreatively, I guess, called RETROspective. Emphasis on retro, because a lot of these are retro dinosaur figures, get it? Yeah. Anyway, I thought that this series could be kind of just brief reviews and a look at the history and the evolution or changes that occurred in different iterations of a figure within the same line. So we're going to start out simply, and you can see here that I've got three different versions of Safari's Acrocanthosaurus, and two of them are very, very similar. So what we're going to do is just start with the oldest one and kind of go through, take a look at them, maybe a quick little walk around and review, and a little bit of comparison with how they changed through the years. So let's start with what I believe is the original. And that is this. This is the Carnegie Collection Acrocanthosaurus that was released in 2001. So why do I think this is the original one? I'm not 100% sure, to be honest with you. These two are very, very similar. You can see there are only very, very subtle differences between the two that I have. But this one is very rubbery. And you can see the whole thing is very, very flexible to the point where its foot is a little bit warped, and it can stand in a tripodal pose, just like that, but it's kind of supposed to stand leaning forward, I think. Anyway, the rubberiness makes me think that this might be an older sample, just because I know that during the early 2000s, around 2004, 2005, Safari across the board, but particularly with the Carnegie line, was switching to a much more rigid plastic. You can see this is still a little flexible, but it is a lot more solid feeling than this rubbery guy here. So I'm gonna just go ahead and assume that this is the older one and clear these guys out of the way. So the Carnegie Acrocanthosaurus, I think, is a really nice model. Just like all the Carnegie models, it really looks like a believable animal in terms of just the soft tissue on it, the way that it's sculpted. It's a little bit of a softer sculpt that you can see compared to the newer Wild Safari one. It's got lots of little wrinkly textures all over it, and sagginess, maybe a little bit more chunkiness. If you look at it from the top, it's got kind of like a triangular cross section. It's kind of hard to see maybe from this angle, where the body just kind of almost hangs down on an angle from the midline ridge. And it does have these nice characteristic spines of Acrocanthosaurus. The feet are relatively small and thin, which kind of necessitates that tripod pose. And like a lot of the Carnegie models from this era, the hands and feet are a little bit crudely sculpted. You can see it's just got painted on black claws, and it's a little lumpy looking. I kind of like the lumpy lookingness of these Carnegies, though. I feel like it gives them a little bit more believability, like you're seeing a real large hulking animal at a distance. And I really like the color scheme on this Acro too. I like the blended dark and light gray with these subtle black stripes. They don't stand out too much, but if you look carefully you can see them. It's like a very subdued color scheme, and the little yellow highlights along the ridge are nice as well. There is some pink and red on the inside of the mouth, the nostril. It's a little sloppily applied on this one. And the characteristic Carnegie gold eye, which started in the early 2000s, is kind of weird, but that was kind of their signature. Now, as a retrospective, what we're going to do is look at how this changed. So this, I believe, is the next iteration of the Acro. Now, this particular sample, as you can see by the feet, was originally attached to a Carnegie Mountain display. It was glued down, had to be ripped off of that display. That allows you to see that it's made of this darker colored gray plastic than the original one, and it actually seems like it might even have some more paint on it. A lot of the mount and display versions seem to have been painted a little closer to some of the prototypes with slightly better paint applications. You can see this one has a little bit more even pink on the inside, a slightly brighter gold eye compared to the old one. And like I said earlier, much less rubbery, much less flexible. I want to take this opportunity to mention the skull. Acrocanthosaurus is an allosauride. It's a very, very large allosauride from the Cretaceous period. Lived alongside Deinonychus and Tenontosaurus in North America, and it has a very distinctive looking skull. This one, though, I don't feel quite captures the real skull of Acrocanthosaurus. First of all, you can see that the sculpt is a little asymmetrical. It's very, very wonky when you look at it face on. The one that I believe is original is a little bit better, but not much better. The placement of the ear is a little funky. I feel like the ear should be lower and farther back, more behind the outline of the skull here on the neck. And it's got this really convex rounded skull and convex rounded jaw. If you imagine this thing with its jaw shut, I feel like it would almost look like an abelosaur, like a Carnotaurus or something, with a really rounded outline or profile. So when they updated this in the Wild Safari line in 2012, we got this figure right here, which is a really nice Acrocanthosaurus figure. And just look at the comparison between the skulls here. You can see what I'm talking about with the deep back of the jaw, more slender front of the jaw, and this high arched but more elongated upper jaw or skull here. And so that is a much more scientifically accurate acro head compared to this one. And this one, despite the scientific accuracy, I feel I don't quite like the skin texture on this one as much. It does have a very, very detailed skin texture, almost like a Papo or a Rebor figure. You can see it's got these rows and rows of small scales with some larger feature scales interspersed along the back. It's got these really nice outlines of the musculature, especially around the legs. If you flip it over here, you can see that too. This really powerful looking leg. It's got the same kind of thin ridge. Both of these have a really thin ridge along the back, which I feel like would probably be even beefier. There are muscle attachment sites along that ridge of spines that make me think this would probably just be almost like a bison, like a big, not a hump, but just a continuous ridge of muscle thickly running down the back. I don't know that this texture, as good and detailed as it looks, reminds me that much of real dinosaur skin. It reminds me of like a Gila monster skin or something. You know, theropods and dinosaurs in general tend to have rosette patterns on their skin and scales. So you'd have one larger scale and a bunch of really tiny minute scales around it, and it would form kind of like, you know, not as linear a pattern as we see here, I think. And I appreciate the extra detail, but just like, you know, my main criticism of Papo and Rebor is adding detail for detail's sake. And I think Wild Safari kind of went through a little phase of that. They've definitely improved on that in recent years. Overall, I do like the color scheme on this one a little bit better. I think it's more contrasty and more striking. It's got that glossiness on the inside of the mouth that makes it look a little wet. It still has a little asymmetry in its face here. And look, it can stand up way better. Ta-da! A lot has been said about the larger feet in Safari's theropods. I think that these feet are about the same size. You can see the difference is that on this one, the claws are way bigger, which may be slightly inaccurate. I don't know that we have soft tissue outlines of those claws. You can also see that the foot pads, let me use this one because it's got better feet. You can see that the foot pads are way wider. And that I feel like is more realistic. I think if you look at large theropod footprints, they did have pretty beefy foot pads around each of those toes, not quite this skinny. So a lot of people will say that the large feet on figures like this sacrifice scientific accuracy for stability, and to some extent that's true, because you can see it's really kind of leaning on this claw. And if these claws were smaller and if those foot pads were not quite as wide, this may topple over in a bipedal pose like this. However, I don't think, if you take into account an appropriate amount of soft tissue, they're really that far off. And the feet are much better sculpted on this one than on the Carnegie. You can see even the bottom has scale detail and pad detail, and the hands are also much better sculpted on this one, on the Wild Safari one I should say. Tooth detail is obviously much nicer, and much nicer head sculpt on the Wild Safari. So you can see that they have come a long way since 2001, and now Safari is doing a much more concerted effort to redo a lot of the older Carnegie models to have them back on the market in their Wild Safari line, which is kind of cool, and will give us fuel for future retrospectives where we can put older and newer models head to head. There's not a lot of variants of the Acrocanthosaurus, but you know, for things like the Stegosaurus, we're going to have a lot of figures out here to retrospect. So thank you for joining me, and I hope you enjoyed this little comparison between Safari then and Safari now, and I'll see you next time on Jurassic Plastic.